In this week's EV news, Seat might not be dead after all, as it sort of commits to keep making cars. Electric cars could go the way of Betamax, according to Mike Rutherford from Auto Express. Electric van maker Arrival is in a bit of a bad way as they teeter on the edge of insolvency. And EV sales are on the rise in Australia. And, well, it's exactly the brands that you'd expect to be doing well that are. Welcome back to another EV news. Now, last week I talked a little bit about the fact that 85% of you that watch this channel regularly are not currently subscribed and how you could help me do something about that. And you have. That number has now fallen to 76.4% of you that are not subscribed that watch the channel. There's still a long way to go, but for those of you that subscribed after watching the last video, thank you very much. And for those of you that have returned this week, haven't seen last week's video, please do click the subscribe button. It helps massively to help the channel grow, but it also helps you because you're much more likely to get notified when I post a video. For those of you that have subscribed, thank you so much for helping the channel grow. It would also be very helpful if you click the like button to convince the algorithm that these videos are worth watching, and it will hopefully spread the word a little bit. Just a reminder, if there's anything you'd like to see in future videos, be that an interesting news article or a particular topic that you'd like to be covered, submit your ideas at dothisnext.co.uk. I noticed that a handful of you have done that already. I'm not ignoring them. I'm going to go through them and we're going to do something with those very shortly. So if you've submitted, I haven't forgotten about you. It's going to happen. And if you haven't submitted yet, do get your ideas in there. Right then, on with the news, and there might be hope after all for Seat's future. Last year, there was a little bit of an uproar in the automotive press when Seat boss Thomas Schaefer said that the future of Seat was Cupra, and the Cupra brand that has now been sort of spun out of Seat to sit on its own, strongly suggesting that the Seat brand would no longer be used for cars once the current model range that they're currently still selling runs out, sort of runs its natural course. The owner of Volkswagen Group was said to be looking to find a different role for Seat in their portfolio, and that it wouldn't necessarily continue to make and sell cars. Seat and Cupra UK boss Marcus Goshen has now told Autocar that the brand is still growing alongside Cupra, and that Seat will have a car in 5 years' time, he says. They're said to be working hard to find the right entry level for the Volkswagen Group so that Seat is properly positioned to be a brand that adds value. And there's a strong inclination that this could actually take the form of a small, cheap EV that could be twinned with the rumoured or upcoming Volkswagen ID.1, the entry-level small sub-20 grand EV that we're promised is going to be coming from the Volkswagen stable. Well, we could see a Seat badged version of it. If this did happen, and obviously it's a very big if at the moment, despite Autocar doing what they usually do and producing these renders of what they think it might look like and all that, and I can show you those, you'd be looking at a cheaper entry into the Volkswagen stable, slightly priced below the ID.1, right, and making Seat the sort of entry-level brand, and really it being a successor to the Seat Me, the little electric Super Mini that they have discontinued now, but as far as I know was pretty successful and a lot of people actually really liked. Now, I'm no huge fan of Seat, to be honest. I've always considered Skoda to be the entry level to the Volkswagen Group. They offer proper value and they actually offer models that I maybe actually want to buy. I've never particularly liked Seat interiors, for example, and I've always found myself a little bit confused about what the purpose of the brand was. I can't be the only person in that boat, although I know some people get oddly sentimental about them. Having said that, if they do pull this off, a cheap entry-level EV for less than 20 grand, it's exactly what the market's looking for, isn't it? And therefore, it could be very successful indeed. I think it's crazy that they discontinued the electric Seat Me along with the equivalent Volkswagen E-Up and the Skoda Citigo, because that is, for me, exactly the kind of car that the market really needs and doesn't currently really have from very many brands. Let me know what you think, though. Should Seat hang on in there and become the entry brand for the VW Group? Or, like me, are you not particularly fussed and would rather just see Skoda fill that role? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. Next up, electric cars could end up like Betamax, according to Mike Rutherford from Auto Express. Now, people drone on about this all the time. It has to be one of the most common tropes that I hear about EVs, and people say it over and over again in the comments, and people say it down the pub. And, oh, they're just the Betamax of the automotive industry. They'll never amount to anything, and they'll soon be gone. Very few people are actually making a valid comparison when they say that, I think. And really, Mike's no exception here. The reason he thinks EVs are like Betamax are customer perception, real world range, and retail prices. So let's consider those in turn, shall we? On customer perception, he says the answer is that manufacturers need to stop talking about BEVs, battery electric vehicles, and instead use the term pure electric or fully electric. It's more appealing, easier to understand. I'm not really sure what difference that'll make, to be honest. Customer perception is largely driven by all the crap you see in the media, and very little of that worries really about what you call them. So, he even says that electric cars would also be a fine term to use. Well, that's what most people call them anyway, and I don't think what the manufacturer puts in their press release really has any difference to people's buying habits and doesn't really affect customer perception. Real world range, that's something I can get behind. The WLTP test, obviously it's standardised, it's the same for every car, and it's meant to help you compare. But the test conditions mean that it's really, really difficult for that to be reflective of a real world range. And people see the X miles that a manufacturer says a car can do, and they say, well, it must do that. Why doesn't it do that? It must be broken, or they're no good, those electric cars, because it doesn't do the X number of miles that they said it would do. But it's because it's a standardised test in a lab, and, it doesn't reflect the real world. And I've said this before. I've said before that a standard for a real world range that everybody needs to follow would go a long, long way to improve consumer confidence and improve the experience for everyone. If you fully understand what the winter range would look like, for example, based on a realistic test that everybody needs to follow, then it would save a lot of that surprise and negativity that you get in the winter when, it won't go quite as far as it usually does. That does seem to catch a lot of people out, and a little bit more transparency from all manufacturers in the same way would help a lot with that. So I do kind of agree with that, in fairness. Retail prices, though, well, it's the usual trope, isn't it, about how private buyers can't afford them and they only get bought by company car buyers because they cost too much. And it's a little bit like the SMMT with their calls for VAT reduction that we talked about in a previous video. And, well, to this, I say what I always do when we discuss price, and if the cost of a new EV puts you off, and for a lot of people it does, buy a second-hand one. And if you can't stand the thought of someone having farted in the seat before you, then buy a pre-registered one. You're at least cutting down on the number of people that have farted in that seat before you. And you'll still save an absolute fortune. People, and by people I mean private buyers, weren't buying new diesel Mondeos and Vectras and stuff like that. In fact, publications like Auto Express and What Car and stuff like that were actively encouraging you not to, as sort of consumer advice, saying, well, depreciation's really high, so buy a cheap bargain used one when the fleets have done with it. And it was a good thing. A lightly used diesel car at a bargain second-hand price was a bargain, but an EV is a depreciation nightmare and you shouldn't go anywhere near it. And I don't follow the logic. Let the fleets deal with the depreciation, because obviously they're getting the big tax reductions and all that stuff, and buy second-hand, buy lightly used, and get on with it, right? The article itself talks about how an electric Corsa is 32 grand and a petrol one is just under 20, but since when have list prices of Vauxhall vehicles been particularly important? You can go to a Vauxhall main dealer right now and you can buy an electric Corsa for less than 20 grand. At pretty much exactly the same price as the petrol one, in fact. Hasn't turned a wheel, probably delivery mileage pre-registered. And I've even seen occasionally them priced slightly lower than what the petrol one costs. So list prices are not relevant. The fact that the list price is 32 grand has no bearing if, as a private buyer, you can walk into a dealer and buy one for less than 20. So the price difference, it makes no real difference to whether someone would buy one or not, because surely you're not just looking at the brochure and going, oh, it's 32 grand, I can't afford that. When you see that you can get one for less than 20, that'll definitely change your perception very, very quickly. So they're too expensive thing is very, very quickly fading away. And As I say, list prices of volume cars like Vauxhalls, etc., were never important to private buyers, and they still aren't. So, nonsense for clicks, basically, is how I'm summing up this article, although I'm sure a lot of you say that about some of these videos. But it's barely even a valid comparison to Betamax, is it? Let's be honest. The failure of Betamax was primarily due to the way it was marketed at the end of the day. Sony executives were convinced that recording time of an hour was more than sufficient, and therefore, tapes that could record for an hour was what everybody wanted, because they were just going to record some TV shows, and therefore that would be absolutely fine. Sort of completely ignoring the fact that films exist and people are going to want to not only record them, but, supply tapes with films on. And VHS tapes could run double that right out of the gate. And I don't need you to comment about range and compare range to recording time, because that's not what we're going for here. But I think people who go on about this are basically saying that petrol cars are VHS and EVs are Betamax. But if we're going to compare technologies here, they should probably both be zero emission, right? Because everybody always forgets about the whole emissions thing and talks about these comparisons. But let's compare two zero emissions technologies, shall we? And compare battery electric with hydrogen fuel cell, for example. I certainly know which one of those is Betamax. I don't know about you, but let me know what you think in the comments. Used bargain of the week time now, where I select a used bargain from Autotrader and tell you what I think about it, basically. Now, given the first story in this week's video, it has to be Seat, doesn't it? And, unlike last time, actually a car. It's a Seat Mii, of course. The electric version of the ever-popular Super Mini. £10,495 buys you the slightly used example. A sensible small city car with a 36 kilowatt-hour battery and, according to EV Database, a real-world range of 130 miles. Seems like an absolute bargain to me. If you can live with the size, it's a little bit smaller than a Zoe, which you can pick up for sort of similar money. But for some people, it's all the car you need and all the car you want. People don't like big cars, they want something small. And, I mean, okay, it's not going to be much use for pounding up and down the motorway, but it's probably better than the petrol version for motorway journeys, let's be honest. If you don't need to go like huge distances, but you need to travel at higher speeds, so the EV drivetrain will inevitably be better than the little 3-cylinder petrol engine to listen to. But ultimately, as a city car doing city car things, it's absolutely ideal for it. Values of these actually almost seem to be firming back up a little bit. I swear you could buy these for like £9,000, or under £10,000 not that long ago. So it's quite interesting if they're creeping back up again. But yeah, for me, Seat Mii, just over £10,000, looks like an absolute bargain. Next up, it's not looking good for Arrival, the British electric van startup that, well, they promised to reinvent the van. The firm is in talks with accounting firm EY about acting as administrator should it have failed to obtain rescue funding. They went public during the pandemic, capitalising on the SPAC boom that we've talked about before, as investors rushed to try and find the next Tesla and were just throwing money at anything, basically. But it seems that that boom is now over. Their stock price has fallen 95% in the past year, and they're looking increasingly unlikely to secure rescue funding or a takeover bid. It's unfortunate news, although there's quite a few of these firms around, isn't there? Startups that have sort of promised the world, yet have barely built anything, and they seem to have very little to show for the sort of quite outlandish claims they're making. So I can't say I'm hugely surprised that they're struggling now. It seems that the cheap money is drying up, and therefore, unfortunately, time is running out for them. I'll keep an eye out to see what happens with them, and I'll bring you an update once we know either way where it's going, but it's not looking good for Arrival. And finally, it looks like EV sales are on the up in Australia, and the brands that, well, realistically you'd expect to be doing quite well are doing quite well. The top 3 selling EVs in Australia in 2023 were from Tesla and BYD, between them accounting for 2/3 of the 87,217 electric cars sold, according to the figures released by the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries. Here's the top 10 on the screen here. Well, Tesla, MG, BYD and Volvo are absolutely cleaning up the market. 7.2% of the 1.2 million vehicles sold throughout Australia in 2023 were powered solely by electricity. That doesn't sound like a huge amount, but when you consider that there are certain categories that are really, really popular over there, that there aren't any vehicles available that are fully electric in, that actually sounds quite good. The Tesla Model 3 is the top selling sedan in the country, easily outselling the once dominant Toyota Camry, despite it being tens of thousands of dollars cheaper. There's also EV action hotting up in the hatchback market, courtesy of the late year arrival of three circa $40,000 contenders, and that is obviously the MG4, the BYD Dolphin, and the Aura Funky Cat, or whatever they call it now. Between those three, they accounted for more than 1,000 sales a month in the final quarter of 2023. So it'd be interesting to see next year what the full year sales of those look like, because it seems like they're very popular indeed. And it means that these three EVs, obviously all Chinese, stole 14% of the small hatchback market. That includes big players like the Toyota Corolla, the Hyundai i30, the Mazda 3, and the Kia Cerato. I find this particularly interesting. Just like here in the UK, the big manufacturers seem to be stalling with EV rollouts, and the Chinese manufacturers are just coming along and running away with it and completely blowing them away. And I don't really understand why everybody's being so lethargic about that lower end of the market, and they're just allowing these big swathes of the market to be just completely blown away by MG, BYD, etc. It's crazy, but it does seem to be happening everywhere. But that's it for this week's EV news. As always, let me know in the comments what you think about any or all of these stories. As I said earlier, make sure you like this video, and if you aren't subscribed, I would appreciate it if you'd subscribe with notifications turned on so that you don't miss out on the next one. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.